Alright, so just hear me out on this one. When somebody wants to play a video game, the best way to do this is by, brace for it, playing a video game. So what's story doing in our games getting in the way of that precious gameplay? Well, the thing is, I think story actually can be a good thing if implemented properly. Question is, how much story are we talking about? Naturally, this depends a lot on what type of game you're talking about. For something like, say, an old action platformer game like Shinobi, often I'll hear people say things like, well, the story's not very good, but it doesn't matter because the gameplay is solid. Well, I would argue that the story actually is good in a game like this because it's doing its job, which is just to provide some basic context for what you're doing. I think of it like this: if a game has a minimal amount of story, it's kind of the game's way of saying, hey, I know that you really just want to play, so I'm going to talk for a little bit, then shut up, get out of the way, and let you get back to playing. Now, if you want to argue that amongst games that do have a minimal amount of story, that little bit of story and the quality of that little bit of story will fluctuate from game to game, then that's fair. But honestly, in most cases, it's such a small amount of story that the player really isn't that invested in whatever it is anyways, and so it's not going to matter that much. Quick little question for you: what is the story in Contra Hard Corps about? Okay, I'll answer. No, actually I can answer because I don't know, and I really don't care, honestly. I remember playing the game and seeing little cutscenes and little bits of story, and it was all cool and fun enough to tie into the theme of the game, but I'm really not that invested in the story of Contra. I just want to blow everything on the screen up. So does this mean that we're some sort of Neanderthals for not wanting too much story in our games? Well, I don't think so, because the thing is, it's not that we don't like stories, we just don't want them in our video games, or at least not every video game. I would say that probably one of the biggest reasons why a lot of retro gamers avoid modern games is because they feel like too many modern games, at least the big budget AAA modern games, indie games are kind of their own thing, but too many of these big budget AAA games just try to jam way too much story down our throats, and we don't have time for it, we don't want it. So we go back to retro games where you're a lot more likely to find something that is very minimal and light on story. Of course, there are still some older games that have more involved stories, with the biggest example probably being RPGs, which, funny enough, RPGs can be a very divisive thing amongst retro gamers, and I think it's for the same reason that modern games are divisive amongst retro gamers. They just have a little bit too much story for some people, and not enough gameplay in contrast. It's all about coming up with a ratio of gameplay to story that the gamer will be accepting of, and of course, this will vary from gamer to gamer and from game to game, so it's just about coming up with that perfect match that's going to work for the individual playing whatever game it is. Of course, the quality of both the gameplay and the story, at least relative to the player, is going to factor in as well. For example, if somebody's really into an RPG and they're really into the story, then they're going to be able to tolerate more story since they're getting invested into it. A lot of times when somebody's not enjoying an RPG, what'll happen is the story is just not gripping them in the way that it needs to for them to want to progress through it. The more that a game forces story onto the player, the more reliant it becomes on just hoping that the player will actually enjoy the story and be invested in it. For example, in a lot of games that are reliant on story, they'll ask you to do something that might be hard to care about if you don't care about the story. Like, okay, I need you to cross this big, huge, giant field so you can get to this place. Well, okay, crossing this big giant field isn't necessarily interesting unless what's on the other side is connected to the story in some deep way that makes it really interesting to get over there, and it makes me feel like I'm on an adventure crossing this big field to get to whatever is so exciting on the other end of it. Now, maybe a game is also able to make crossing a big giant field interesting with its gameplay mechanics as well, but point is, a game that's reliant on story has a much better chance of getting away with not having interesting gameplay through that section than a game would be if it was very reliant on its gameplay mechanics. Can you imagine if the first level of Super Mario Bros. Didn't have any Goombas or obstacles anywhere on it? It would probably be pretty boring. For a game like that, it's relying on its gameplay, so it can't just lean back on its story to incentivize the player to get through that part of the game. And while we're talking about Super Mario Bros., that game is a good example of a game that doesn't rely on story in order to incentivize you to do whatever it is that you're doing in the gameplay aspect. So a Goomba's running at you and you don't really need to know why, you just know that thing is a little turd coming at you and it's gonna shrink you into small Mario, so it needs to be smashed. I mean, what if that little Goomba had hopes and dreams? It wanted to be an aspiring poet, or perhaps it was just trying to get to another Goomba that it was in love with on the other side of Mario. It doesn't matter in this context, it just exists to be a small little brown turd that you want to smash. Ultimately, I think it's important that there's both games with story and without story. That way everybody can have what they want, and video games as a whole have a lot more depth as far as what kind of experience they can offer to the gamer. And sure, everybody's gonna just want more games that are the type of games that they like, but personally speaking, if there's a few less games that are the type of games I like in favor of other games that other people are really enjoying, I can live with that. There are so many games in existence that I think it's fine, there's enough. But with all of that said, for this video's question, I want to ask all of you, what percentage of the time are you playing games that have a very minimal amount of story? For example, for me, I would say 90% of the time I'm playing games that have little to no story in them, and 10% of the time I do play games that I would describe as having a moderate to even a lot of story in them. I'm really curious to hear how those answers break down. I'm guessing a lot of you are going to heavily favor games with very little story, but we'll see. So leave those comments down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's the retro bird.